Alors, mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, bienvenue à la dernière session de cet congrès. Je vous remercie vraiment pour votre fortitude, pour être avec nous après une semaine assez longue, mais très intéressante. So, welcome to the final session. You will see from the composition of the panel here that we're doing things in a way that's slightly different from what we had imagined, and we're going to do this in a much more informal way. But rather than save some of the thank yous and the announcements to the end, I'd like to do that, and then we'll have a more informal conversation here at the front, and then to engage all of you. And then I might just let you in on a little secret about a little corner of Carleton's campus called Mike's Place, and I'll explain to you in a moment what that is. But I would now like to introduce to you, in her new role as past president of the Canadian Association of Refugee and Forced Migration Studies, Michaela Hynie has a few words to say.
So I just want to very briefly say a huge thank you to the organizing committee for what has been a stimulating, exciting, and engaging conference. And my last act as one-time president is to announce who our next president is going to be. So I'd like to congratulate Bruno Duperron, am I pronouncing his name correctly? Duperron, yep. From the University of Saskatchewan, who will be our new incoming president as of right now. And unfortunately, he's not here because he has to be at Scout Camp tomorrow. I'd just like you to know that we're well-rounded on the executive. And the last, I'd also like to welcome and thank the many people who have stepped forward to be new members of our executive and the continuing members. It's going to be a very exciting year. And the last thing I would like to say is I would like to announce the location of next year's conference. So next year, CARFMS will actually be held at the Center for Refugee Studies in York University. It'll be around the same time, maybe a little bit earlier, May 14th to 19th, probably, immediately after the Center for Refugee Studies summer school. So we look forward to welcoming you there. Bring your friends, bring your family. We were just suggesting you should bring pets, and the more the better. And I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again, everyone.
Before we begin the closing session, I do want to make sure to say a few thank yous to people who have really helped make the essence of the conference possible, and especially in seeing us through some of the technological efforts that we have made at this conference. I'd like to thank Shu, who's been doing the video recording and the video link. I'd like to thank James, who's been doing the tech in this room and also running and helping with the tech in the other room. I'd like to thank the translators who are from the translation program at the University of Ottawa, and our colleagues from Freeman who have made the work of the technological work of the translation seamless. So if you could join me, please, in thanking our colleagues. And I see that Erin has not come into the room, so I'm going to embarrass her when she comes in. But I would like to say, I think speaking on behalf of Nimo, Jay, and myself, that while we sit up here representing the organizing committee in bringing the intellectual project of the conference to some form of conclusion, that nothing from the name tags to the programs to the butter tarts to the room selections, everything that has gone into making this possible simply would not have been possible without Erin and without there you go, without Erin and without our volunteers. Erin, stand up, please. They have made it look tremendously easy, but if you can, KK is sitting close enough, you can see the gray hairs on my head. There have been many challenges along the way, and the fact that we are here satisfied and well attended to. Aaron, this simply would not have been possible without your help and the excellent support from the team of volunteers. So really, from the bottom of my heart, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you. So what we propose to do to bring this conference to a close is to remind us of the themes, the challenges, the tasks that we set ourselves from the outset, the themes that Jay introduced. Jay, Nimo, and I each have a question in terms of our takeaway from the conference, the remaining challenges, and in terms of where we can go next as a research community. What I propose that we do is each of us will take a lead on one of these questions and pose it to KK and to Osama. Unfortunately, both Heaven and Louisa are unable to join us. Some of you may have heard the rumor that we were told to expect Minister Hussein. Turns out that no one in his office knew that he was going to be in Montreal today. So there you go. There you go. And then what we really want to do is to engage you in this dialogue as well, because as you may remember from the call from proposals, and Shana, who made the point during Louise's presentation, she reminded us at last year's CARFMS there were these ethical guidelines on research with displaced persons that was put forward by Christina Clark-Kazak. And one of the inspirations from this for this conference was the notion that the kind of engaged research that we seek to undertake is really premised or predicated on the understanding of different forms of dialogue, that we can have dialogue within the research community, between different geographic regions, across disciplines, but also to have dialogue with the practitioner community and with the policy community, however heterogeneous those communities may be. This is motivated by debates within refugee and forced migration studies, but debates within scholarship more generally. B.S. Chimney, in his piece on reforming the refugee regime, drew on the work of Habermas to talk about the various forms of dialogue that can animate the pursuit of solutions to the challenges that we all consider to be abhorrent and unacceptable. And likewise, as we mentioned with KK's keynote on Thursday, just yesterday, this notion from Lauren Landau of the tyrannies of partnership, and that there are, and Heaven made this clear in her keynote, the notion that there are deep asymmetries of power that are inherent in all of the relationships that run through the research enterprise. And whether we can overcome those, or at least be more critically self-aware of the presence of these power relations as we seek to contribute the research enterprise in some way that contributes to this overarching objective of protection and solutions. So with that, the question that I want to pose to colleagues on the panel, and before I turn it over to all of you, is we've been very blessed in these past few days with the real richness of the ideas that we've had and the depth of the exchanges that we have enjoyed. And to really get a sense from those of us here of what do we take away? What's the one takeaway message in terms of our ability to encourage dialogue? What are the notes of optimism, or what do you take away as an idea from which we can build as raised in this conference? So let me pose that first to anyone on the panel who is there. Let's start with a note of optimism in terms of what have you seen that you take away and that you find encouragement in from our discussion today. KK or Osama, do you want to start us off on that?
Thank you, James. One of the things that, in fact, I didn't know, or I didn't think about it before, is the value of such an event, a conference, in this context, is to see the obstacles from the eyes of others as well. And I never thought, like, the presentation that Khoti presented for us and the challenges that the Global South in academia witnesses is so much reality. I never thought about it before. And what Heaven also told us, also what Louisa told us, and in so many sessions that I've seen, there were bits and pieces before to me, and today, as somebody from outside, they make a sense, they make a bridge. And from the eyes of the participants here, the academia outside as well, organizations, all kind of actors, they make now bridging. Now I understand why would a university in Kenya would need support, or what kind of support. I would understand what the challenges researchers face in the field, and that I would tackle this if I am in charge of tackling the issue. I would be in a position to understand how to make the most out of a certain research, in bridging and in connecting researchers to the field. I think that's the most that I could think the value of what I got from this conference.
So sort of the idea of perspective.
Exactly.
I'm putting them on the spot.
Immediately two things. And the first one is precisely the session that we had today, the presentation from Louisa, Refugee 613, and precisely the dilemma of the issue, the dilemma we find ourselves in when we want to negotiate with policymakers. It is inevitable. They are a major actor in this sector, so inevitably you have to deal with them. And it is even necessary to deal with them. But that at the same time, we have to understand that we should not do it in such a manner that to compromise the integrity and the impartiality and the independence that is required of our work. It is one thing to cohabit with policymakers. It is an entirely different thing to share a bed sheet. So that, for me, that's one. But the second thing that I'm coming out of this conference is to realize how heterogeneous actors are. That a lawyer alone is not enough, right? A social worker alone is not enough. Somebody who is a political scientist also is not enough. All of us have to work as a team. I think if we do that way, we are of better value to those we seek to promote. And the third and last thing, I was very encouraged as I came out from this conference to learn that there are initiatives, in fact, global initiatives, to get young scholars engaged in this issue. And that's very, very important because there has to be a succession plan. Those of us who are here today, the so-called seniors, some with gray hair, others without even hair at all, sooner or later we will not be in these positions. So it is important that there should be a succession plan, because the issue of refugees, forced displacement, unfortunately, is not a transitional issue. It is not an epidemic like Ebola or something that is here today. It's bad, it's ugly, but it will not be in the next 10, 15 years, it will not be here. Unfortunately, from my experience, I think the issue of forced displacement is here to stay, probably beyond our lifetime. So those three things: relationship, not a marriage, succession plan, but heterogeneity of those of us who are involved in this issue of displacement. Thank you.
One of the takeaways for me, and then I'll give Jay and Nimo an opportunity if you have a thought on this, and then open it up in terms of the takeaways. Before I came to start the position at Carleton, there was a senior scholar at the university where I was before doing my postdoc. You can look up online where that was. I won't name and shame here. But they said, what's your goal in going to Ottawa? What are you going to get out of your time at Carleton? I said, I'm really excited about going to Ottawa and being proximate to the policy community, proximate to NGO community there, and I'm really going to invest in, building relationships. And he said, that's a complete and utter waste of time. I said, what do you mean? He said, as an academic, what you want to do, you want to work on your brand. You want to build up your portfolio. You want to publish your articles. And who cares about all of that? All you want to do is you want to build up your CV, make yourself marketable, and maybe you'll end up at a better university one day. I have to say, as a shameless plug to the university where I currently am, that it's these kinds of conversations that need to be encouraged not only by individuals. I think something that we heard quite a bit is the importance of the interpersonal relationship, of building those relationships from the research to the policy community, within the research community, across disciplines, that it's very much that investment of time. But also for all of us to convince our institutions of the utility of this work. And something that was really striking from Heaven's keynote is how the ranking process in the UK right now has created the most perverse political economy of knowledge production, where the only scholarly activity that's valued, that determines the outcome of your career, determines whether or not you get tenure, that those activities are only publishing, but not just publishing in very particular journals and publishing with very particular presses. And I think that from the academy, that there's a real responsibility for us to be able to communicate to our institutions and to our governments the value of a more ecumenical understanding of what constitutes scholarly activity. I'm very fortunate to be at a university that values the sort of non-tangible work of fostering dialogue and giving, going down to global affairs and giving a talk and what have you, that it's not going to result in an 8,000-word peer-reviewed article, but I would argue that it's a better use of my time. And something that I take away is a real encouragement and empowerment to hear that there are other actors and other voices and other colleagues across communities that shares that same idea. And so there's an advocacy obligation that we now have to be able to communicate this back to our institutions to make sure that the value of these more fungible activities, that this value is understood, and that we need to challenge these very oppressive influences in the political economy of knowledge production.
James. In terms of the conference, it's been a very humbling experience, both as an organizer and also to be fortunate enough to attend a few panels when I had the time, when I was not running around trying to fix Skype connections in different parts of Ridgecraft Hall. But more specifically as a doctoral researcher, I think this was particularly interesting for me, having been a practitioner prior to this. And also trying to look at forced migration research from a more cross-sectional perspective. So it's quite amazing to see the kind of research that is being undertaken across the world, not only in Canada, but across the world. So amazing, impressive range of speakers, and I've had the fortune of interacting with quite a few people at a personal level after certain panels and seminars as well. What I found very interesting was the heterogeneity, and I want to build off of KK's point here on the heterogeneity of the research that is being undertaken as well. Building out of institutions rather than just feeling institutionalized or being constrained by institutional barriers. I think a lot of people have become more open to carrying out research that does not it's not according to what the institution wants, but according to what the community that we are researching on requires as from researchers. And it's one of the main things that I found very interesting was, and again, forgive me for using the word Global South, KK, but the research that is being undertaken in parts of the world where it's not institutionalized as much as it is in Canada. Mm-hmm. So African researchers and me as a researcher from South Asia. So it's great to see that kind of research being undertaken as well. So those are some of the takeaways from CARFMS 2018.
Nimo?
Thank you both. For me, the takeaway was the amount of work, the hard work we we put into, and the struggles that after the fear of the strike, where we are going to be, the selection that we put on which abstract and who to select and how to put the programs. And actually seeing all those abstracts that were selected and how good they were, and the information they were providing, or the critical conversation that the academics, the students, and the community, and service providers and policymakers were having in each room. I participated in some of the panels, and I watched, and it was a wonderful event. So seeing that product and the hard work that in action, it was good. The other thing I took away from is the interest that students have in refugee studies. As a refugee myself and doing a refugee work all the time, and supervising students in this type of study, and I look what the future look like, who is going to do this work, and who is interested, and which part of the world do they belong to. So seeing the interest of the students was huge. The other takeaway that I have is I am one of those people, well, I am East African, so I think passionately, and I talk passionately, and I write passionately what I'm thinking. So having Crowley gave me a thought, like things that how what I say or what I write can be a policy issue into the community, and we had an example into that. So putting a thought that you want to put a knowledge out there, but to think about how that knowledge can be used in policy. So just stop and think before you write. Stop and think before you present an idea, and that's what I learned. The other thing I learned today is the difficulty that we have as somebody who was a service provider for 20 years. I saw the issue that was going on as a service provider, between the connection between service provider and researchers, and the demand that they put, and the miscommunication that can happen, and the need, how each needs other, but there is no communication. And so what can we do from now on, moving forward? And that's what I learned from Louise's conversation today. Yeah.
Before we move on to the broader question of sort of where we go next, I'd like to invite comments or interventions from all of you in terms of reflecting on this theme of dialogue and the process of dialogue and the various forms of dialogue. Is there a takeaway that is striking to you in terms of either what's possible with dialogue or what's achievable through this dialogue, or how your understanding of this concept of dialogue has changed over the past 3.5 days? Are there any comments that anyone would like to bring into this conversation from the floor? Michaela.
The one comment I would like to make is that it has reinforced a theory that has guided a lot of my own work, which is Professor Wessie's triangle that moved the mountain, that says that in order to actually shift difficult problems, you need to have collaboration from lawmakers, from thought leaders who can help shift public opinion, and from researchers who can provide the data that can speak to each of these. And among thought leaders, I would include the thing that's missing, I think, from that triangle is that the individual is affected by the situations that you're working in. Their voices also need to be heard. And the idea is that one has to collaborate across all of these sectors in order to be able to capitalize on each of our own experiences, networks, and opportunities for influence. And what I liked about the keynotes today was that they demonstrated how bringing together across these multiple boundaries, people who are connected to these different kinds of knowledge, to different networks, allows us to have more power to actually shift difficult issues.
Yes, was.
I think dialogue is a powerful tool. Sorry, let me rephrase that. I think the dialogue is very powerful, and it can sort of like separate between like this us versus them mentality. You know, when you start having the conversations, you know, like in the beginning, you see just the label of a migrant or a refugee, but when you start like sharing ideas between one another, you begin to learn, and then you you start to realize, okay, like it's not as simple as, you know, just getting over to the border and then starting to like uh, just starting a new life altogether in general. You know, there's just these issues that you have to get over, like language and so on and so forth. So I think just creating that sort of dialogue is very powerful and gives everyone the opportunity to be heard and just be separated away from the label and that us versus them mentality.
Are there any, before we move on to the question of the challenges that remain and what we can go on to do from this, are there questions for the panel in terms of the sort of the takeaways from the conference? Yes, sir.
Khoti, I was wondering if you think that I just hear when you say talking like to policymakers, and it's sort of it sounds like academia and policies are very separate. Do you think that there's a place for policymakers to be academics and for academics to be policymakers?
Yeah, my experience in working in living in Tanzania, I don't know what is the situation here in Canada, but I get a sense that it is markedly different from the situation back home. Why am I saying so? I am saying so, again, another paradox which I didn't point out is that the University of Dar es Salaam, for example, is a public institution, 100%. So you would assume that each time the policymakers sit down, if they have a problem, they want to review the law, for example, or they review the policy, or whatever it is in the area, for example, of migration, they will turn their eyes to the public institution they have created to try to assist them with insights. But that doesn't happen, right? We don't have a formalized, institutionalized system of engagement between policymakers and those of us who are in research and academia, right? So most of the times what happens is that I keep mumbling in pubs, street corners, you know, and classrooms, right? Instead of me sitting around the table, right, with those with responsibility for formulating policies. So we lack that forum. We lack an institutionalized, predictable forum. For example, if I have thoughts, if I have concerns, I should have the sense, okay, September is approaching. We normally would have that national dialogue between. We don't have that. So it's very sporadic, and it's a pity. It's a pity because it doesn't make sense. So policymakers, they create an institution, right, with the responsibility of essentially serving as an advisory body, if you want, but that doesn't happen. It happens sporadically. You will be walking, for example, in the streets, and somebody, oh, KK, you know what? Oh, we are organizing a seminar tomorrow for for those who are going to assess claims tomorrow. Do you think you'd have time between 9 and 10? So things are happening like that. Very, very serious things, but they're happening in that fashion. So I think it's a pity. It shouldn't be that way. We should have a formal, regular, predictable forum, right, for engagement between those of us in academia and research and those that are responsible for policy. But unfortunately, that is not the case as yet. I've satisfactorily answered, I hope.
And what I might do is sort of suggest, and here I'm looking at Nimo and Jay, and sort of go off script a little bit, because I think this leads very much to that question in terms of, you know, as much as we can say what a wonderful conference and all, you know, it's emphasized the importance of dialogue. I think it's also emphasized the fact that this dialogue doesn't happen on its own. And so there's the question of the challenges and, you know, what do we feel we can do in terms of taking next steps to realize this kind of collaborative, this kind of partnership, this kind of dialogue that I think in some way we all subscribe to as being necessary, but so that it's not the bump into someone on a street corner and this and that, and it's also not necessarily, or maybe it need, but that it's not reliant on personal relationships and networks, but that on the one hand that there are those personal relationships, but there's also a fabric that binds it together in a way that's not as haphazard or episodic, that it's superficial. That's right. So maybe I would propose that we now turn to the question of, well, having had this conference and eaten all of those sandwiches and drunk all those cups of coffee, and going back to the question that Neil asked after KK's keynote, having spent all of this money on this conference, how do we demonstrate that value? Where do we go from here? What do we feel we can do next in terms of realizing the kind of dialogue we seem to agree to be necessary? And so maybe I'll use that as a last question to put to the panel. And before this panel, Jay, Nimo, and I had a discussion of the questions that we would ask and what have you. So my apologies to sort of take us in a different direction, but recognizing where we are in proceedings, that seems to flow well from KK. So if you don't mind, is that if we go that way? So maybe I would invite anyone from the panel here with an idea of, as members of the research community, what do we think is possible? What do we think we can work towards? And I invite suggestions and ideas from all of you in terms of, what do you now feel able or willing or excited to do moving on from this conference?
So I would like to start with the idea of challenges. As I said, having been a practitioner earlier and now trying to be an aspiring or an emerging scholar, I feel that the challenges continue to exist in terms of institutions sometimes being close-minded, and this is not a generalization of any sort. From my experience of having worked in the UNHCR and more specifically in a specific context, I feel that ideas that emerge from academia can often be viewed as being very abstract or does not really fit within the themes of what the institution would like to do. So one challenge that I might probably foresee is that getting institutions to actually listen to us, perhaps as willing participants of this community. Rather than looking at refugees as a subject to be studied, we should probably start looking at possible solutions and protection mechanisms that could effectively promote a better dialogue between researchers and policymakers alike. So in terms of the next steps, and I'm going to try and steal Temrice's point from her last panel, she made an excellent point on saying that we would sometimes want to make certain contexts look good, and researchers might sort of hold back in terms of saying, okay, this might be a bit shaky, that we may not want to put our name out there, especially if you're writing about a given context. And I think the challenge, or probably the next step here, would be for us to be brave enough to actually say, well, this is the situation, and this is how we can move forward. So perhaps that would lead into an effective partnership between institutions that are critical within the context of forced migration research. So I'll leave it there.
Osama and Nimo?
For me, the challenge I saw is actually the KK's one of the PowerPoints. It was showing that the refugee producing continents, in terms of continents, in terms of race, and he mentioned 30% of the refugees are coming from Africa. But we are talking about when we see in the research, what we see is the researchers who are doing the work are from global north, as KK said again. how do we involve and bring those voices, the refugee voices, actually be from those who are producing the refugees? Because that is, they know what they need, and they know what the solution should be, and they know what the long-term impact is going to be, because we already have facts what the long-term impact, what we learn from prolonged stays in camps. So the challenge is, how do we expand and include those who are coming from global south? Like we learned from KK's presentation, the challenges that he faced when he is trying to do research. How do we support and involve those who are there? And how do we support also the emerging scholars who are from global south, who are doing their work here? And who are a kind of informant to what's happening out there. So those are the challenges. Like we are not really expanding what the work that we are doing. We are just each thinking about where we are, including just geopolitics. There is geopolitics into research. There is policy into research, and there is race into research. Who is being impacted and who is doing what, and who is powerful to have a voice in those terms. So instead of talking about refugees, how do we involve them so they can talk about themselves? And how do we work with them? How do we encourage them? How do we empower them to be part of the table, not really the menu?
I'll start with the. Hi. I'll start with the challenges. So, one of the first point is how to address an audience that is not believing in your idea. I mean, when you work on something, the people who read your work are people who are already on your side, and you need to change an idea in a society or to change a policy. You need to address the others, those who don't believe in you. You need to convert them somehow, and I think that's a challenge. You need to strike a balance between decent academic work and attractiveness to those who don't believe in you. And I attended what Michaela was working on, and it struck me. It's amazing. It's not because she's sitting here. It's something. No, seriously, it's something I would like to see mainstreamed all around the world, because this work countries want to see, policymakers want to see, because it helps them shape better policy. It helps them understand the system, even if they don't want to, but it's actually something that helps producing much better system that everybody would benefit from. Countries will not be more burden to help, and refugees would benefit much more than just hiding behind those policies that we have today. So that brings me to the idea of a suggestion. I dream big. Sorry. I heard so many brilliant ideas in this conference, and many of them came out of just in that moment. So I was wondering, because I work also in networking, I was wondering, why wouldn't the migration and refugee studies departments in universities all over the world, or most of them, create more like a pool where academicians and maybe practitioners pool their ideas, what's missing. So I have a missing idea. I would like to see the global governance cycle. When is the best to influence? How to influence it? And I don't find a study about it. So maybe I'd like to see that. Now there are so many PhD students that would love sitting there and don't have a concrete idea, and I was one of them, still am, what exactly to write about. Now, if somebody comes, if James now tells me, you know what, there's this idea, why don't you work on it? Oh, you know what, it's brilliant. Let me work on it. And I would like to see kind of a pool of ideas where people or organizations or academicians or policymakers where PhD students or researchers would actually write something that would benefit everybody.
I'm going to take the liberty of sort of following up on that, because the ideas that I wanted to add before I turn it over to any final questions or comments from the floor before bringing this to a close. You know, the three ideas that I want to share. First is, it seems very obvious, but the notion of solidarity, and not to take this notion of solidarity for granted. Implicit in Heaven's presentation, and Osama, this speaks very much to, you know, why isn't there sort of, what are the structural drivers that make that kind of collaboration more challenging? It's competition for research funding. You know, that there, and so, you know, it's being mindful of working within the structures that lead to outcomes that are contradictory to solidarity, and recognizing that we can't take that solidarity for granted. The fact that we all work on these issues and believe in them and want to see solutions doesn't necessarily mean that there is an incentive structure to cooperate. So I think it's really recognizing that there are these drivers that work against the notions of dialogue. So how do we create incentives? You know, the funding agencies, certainly in Canada, give all of this lip service to partnership and collaboration. If you go outside, if you go back into the atrium, you know, what's the word that's emblazoned in sort of the glass panels on the third floor of Richcraft Hall? Collaborate. You know, it's, you know, but how do you collaborate mindful of the structures that create financial incentives to collaborate in particular ways? And so, you know, where I'm very encouraged by this was one of the points that KK made, is the notion of, you know, that there are these incredibly powerful hegemonic structures, and there's this incredible disparity in the allocation of these opportunities. And I often get quite consumed by the prevailing nature of these, and KK gave very good advice, is, you know, we're not going to change it in a day, but where can we make these incremental contributions slowly over time with the dream of what is possible? What are the steps that we can take to get there over time? There's some very wise and patient people have told me that lasting change takes time. And so the idea that something's going to be changed through one global compact, or that things are going to get changed, you know, I'm sure there will be one PhD that will change the world. It certainly wasn't mine. You know, that there will be an effort to work incrementally and collectively. But then the last point that I want to stress before handing it to KK, and then seeing if there are questions or comments from all of you, is a point that Louisa made about sector literacy. It's a point that Osama made in his intervention, and I think this is probably the basis. This is where we might be able to make some fairly immediate change, is the notion of walking a mile in someone else's shoes, of being able to explain what are the constraints of research centers in certain regions of the world, what are the planning cycles for governments, for NGOs, with this partnership that we've been alluding to, which involves the co-creation of knowledge around how civil society is able to influence the functioning of the refugee regime in contexts such as Kenya, Tanzania, Lebanon, and Jordan. One of the first conversations with the NGO partners was, what are the times of year where we should plan our priorities? And the first thing they said is, please don't make it mid-October. But of course, from an academic point of view, that's the perfect time of the year to have that conversation. So really, to have these very pedantic conversations in terms of what's a busy time of the year, what's an easier time of year, what's involved in your planning cycle. You know, the difficulties in terms of academic planning cycles are glacial compared to humanitarian NGOs. But it's not a question that anyone's necessarily going to change. We're not going to change the timing of ethics boards or the SSHRC funding cycles in Canada. But so long as we are able to not assume, you know, they say about when you assume that, well, anyway, I won't say it because we're being recorded, but, you know, that when you assume that you create real difficulties. So to be as overt as we can when we begin these dialogues about these are the parameters within which I work. These are the parameters that are fixed. These are the ones that are more flexible. So I think the notion of solidarity, of working incrementally to create structures that make that solidarity more permissive, but really to emphasize this notion of sector literacy and to really begin conversations with more critical self-awareness in terms of the parameters, the constraints, and the capabilities. What is the value added that we can bring to this? There was a political cartoon that I read 25 years ago, and it began with one person standing in a grassy field looking up and saying, I'm just one person, what can I do? And then the next frame of the cartoon, it's like the camera pulled out one frame, and then you realize that there are three people standing in the park, and they're all looking up saying, I'm just one person, what can I do? The next frame of the cartoon, it pulls out a little bit more, and all of a sudden there are 10 voices across the city saying, I'm just one person, what can I do? And of course, the last frame, in a very rainbows and tambourines kind of sense, the very last frame of the cartoon is a picture of the entire world and in all of the language around all the world saying, I'm just one person, what can I do? Well, it's recognizing that if we all think about the small incremental contribution that we can make, and if we're willing to make that in a way that isn't necessarily that contributes to this idea of solidarity, intersectoral solidarity, then I think that we can start seeing these kind of incremental gains that will make conferences like this worth the price tag.
Thank you. Yes, this is the last word I want to...
Depends what you're going to say. I mean, if it's
my appeal, as I said, one of the things that I'm walking away with from this conference is the optimism I see, the enthusiasm of young scholars. For me, that is very, 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 very critical, because where I come from, when I look behind me, who is behind me, I'm left trembling. I'm left trembling because I'm beginning to become very skeptical what will happen to studies at my university in this area. So my appeal is for the young scholars, please theorize, go into abstract theories and all this thing. Do, for example, what one of my nieces, once did. I found her sitting on a couch with her eyes closed, but with a mirror in front of her eyes. So I'm asking her, Martha, what are you doing? She says, Uncle, I want to see what I look like when I'm asleep. Okay. So it is in the nature of academia to theorize, to be curious, and all that. So that is on one side. On the other side, let us not leave. Let us keep common sense with us. Let us leave common sense with us, with all the theories, the knowledge, and the stuff. But let us keep common sense with us. There was a story that orthopedic surgeons were meeting at an annual conference such as this, and they were debating about what should be the ideal lengths of different parts of the body. You know, medicine, they're preoccupied with what is the ideal height, what is the ideal weight, how long should the tongue be, and all these things. So these are orthopedic surgeons, they're debating how long, ideal length of... So they're discussing late into the night, the janitor, it's a poor lady who wants to come to the hall and clean it up. She's unable to do that. She's unable to go home to her family because the orthopedic surgeons are debating. So she walks in and asks, what's going on? And so somebody tells her, they're debating about what is the ideal length of the foot. Some are saying 83 centimeters, others are saying 95. And so she says, can I go and wind up this? Can I say something? So luckily enough, they were humble enough to invite her to come forward. So she comes forward to the podium, takes the microphone, and I hear you're discussing the ideal length of the foot, the human leg, and you're not in agreement. As far as I know, I think the ideal length of the foot should be long enough to support the body. That will be the ideal length of a leg. So it's not so much in centimeters, but the function. The legs, the essence of the leg, it should be long enough to support the torso. So it should move from the torso to the ground. So depending on how tall you are, it will vary. So for some it will be 75, others it will be 80. So common sense. So let us theorize, abstract, but common sense should not leave us. Common sense should not leave us. But the more critical thing, the substantive thing, is that I hope, and I'm talking to Michaela, but I'm also talking to other members of the Canadian Association for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies, that I would suggest that you think about a continuity in the themes, so that the theme of this year should find reflection, should resonate in the theme of next year. So that next year when we or you meet, there should be some reflection. Okay, last year we had somebody called Osama. He brought in this issue of refugee voices. And there was some critique about, they are doing a good thing, but there was critique. So what has happened over the last 12 months or so? There were students, there were some colleagues who presented research proposals, and they benefited from critique, from insights and reflection from the conference. How far have they gone? What has happened? What has happened to those groups? So that they would be continued. So over a period of 5-6 years' time, you would have built a really credible corpus of knowledge, because something was said, it was tested, and yeah. So I hope that in designing the theme, you'll make space in the program to try to reflect what was discussed the last conference in Ottawa. With those few words, let me shut up.
Before we close, are there any questions or comments from the floor?
Or critique.
So,
Okay.
sorry. So, if there are no further questions, I would like to thank you all for being here on a Friday afternoon towards the end of the conference. I would like to thank everyone for continuing to participate in all of the sessions and panels and keynotes. And this has been a wonderful experience. Personally as well, I've had the fortune of meeting a lot of you and interacting with a lot of you. So I hope to see you all next year in CARFMS 2019. Safe travels, and thank you very much. Thank you.